Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gamer Telecom video, we're going to be continuing part 3 of our analysis of the recent interviews as Microsoft have defended the Xbox One's architecture. So we've been through the entire interview, and as we did, I gave my thoughts on it. So now, I think we're going to be discussing the interview as a whole, where I think Microsoft's position is after the interview, and also what I'd like for them to clear up, because there's still quite a few mysteries. And here's the thing, I've had people message me and asking me, well, what would I like to see from Microsoft? And it's kind of a difficult question right now. Sony are really overplaying the fact that, you know, they have a supercharged PC architecture and all. And I think from the perspective of developers, from what I'm hearing, yes, they are very happy with the Sony architecture. Yes, it's very powerful. You know, it's very easy to use and so on. But the reality of the matter is that I think developers were hoping for more. I mean, I've mentioned this several times over, and you can Google this, that Epic wanted about 2.5 teraflops of computing power. That's what they shot for with the Samaritan demo, and so on. So I think the developers initially wanted a little bit more power, even out of the PS4. But let's talk about the Xbox One for a moment. There are a couple of concerns I have with the system, and there are a couple of mysteries as well. So let's start with the mysteries. Let's, begin by being Scooby-Doo for a while. Now, those of you who are eagle-eyed will have noticed that in the various reports and conferences that Microsoft have given, for example, the Hot Chip conferences, you'll have noticed that they say SOC summary. Now I'm going to read this thing in verbatim because it's not too long, but still. High performance but power efficient, very low power modes, AV in and out media hub. That would be the HDMI in and out for the UNI. Specialized audio, graphics and video processors. Offload CPU and graphics core. So that would of course be, for example, the Shape audio processor, the Move engines and so on. Fantastic. CPU, GPU, specialized processors and I/O share memory via host guest MMUs and synchronized page tables. Fine, we've discussed that already. High bandwidth CPU, cache coherency, spoken about that. 200 gigabytes per second plus power efficient memory balanced to CPU, GPU, specialized processors and I/O requirements. So of course that would be, for example, ESRAM. And this is the part that confuses me. DX11.1 plus graphics core with custom graphics and compute command processors to offload CPU and improve GPU. So that's a little bit weird, because we do know the tiled resources is on the Xbox One. Now, the PlayStation 4, on the other hand, is a little bit different. The PS4, from its tech slides that have been released by Sony, as well as the leaks, state that it has DX11.2 compatibility. Now, here's the thing that's confusing to a lot of people, because they're saying, well, what gives? Now, there was some speculation that people have been saying, well, maybe Microsoft uses a different version of the hardware, and so on. However, in the interview in question, it states, and I quote, just like our friends, we're based, and obviously they're talking about Sony, we're based on the Sea Islands family. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar what the hell the Sea Islands family is, it is a family of GPUs which is based on the GCN architecture. The Sea Island family is actually the Radeon 8000. Now, before anyone gets amazingly excited and jumps up and down and says, well, that's better than the 7000, it's actually not. Pretty much identical GPUs, and by pretty much is exactly the same GPU. The only difference is it was rebadged, and they made a couple of tiny little tweaks here and there, but it's pretty much exactly the same thing. However, AMD have said the Radeon HD 7000 series hardware architecture is fully DX11.2 capable. When used with a driver that enables the feature, AMD is planning to enable DX11.2 with a driver update in Windows 8.1. Launch timeframe in October, which is this year. when DX11.2 ships. Today, AMD is the only GPU manufacturer to offer full compatibility with DX11.1 support, and the only manufacturer to support tiled resources tier 2 with a shipping product stack. Now, in case you're not exactly familiar with that, tiled resources is, of course, the texture technique that Microsoft have pioneered, which goes in with DX11.2, and it's also going to be part of the Xbox One feature set. Now, the purpose of it is to basically, as you're getting closer to a certain object, whatever the object is, whether it's a wall, whether it's a mountain, whether it's a sea, a planet, whatever, it's been textured. As you get closer, basically, the object will always swap in a higher resolution version of the texture. And so, theoretically, you can put 1, 2, 3, 4 gigs of textures, or equivalent to, in a very small amount of space. For example, 16 megs. Now, if anyone's kind of getting any ideas on what this could be used for, you betcha this would be the ESRAM. It's a fairly good bet that Microsoft are going to heavily encourage tiled resource use on their titles, right? That is actually a really good also thing for PCs as well, may I add, because obviously it can far benefit them. So I'm unsure why Microsoft haven't said DX11.2. Most likely, however, it will support DX11.2. It's possible that it might only support DX11.1, and if that's the case, it would still have tiled resources, but they would be tier 1 tiled resources rather than a tier 2 tiled resources. So obviously that's just various differences in the feature set and the abilities of the tiled resource instruction set. So my best guess, and I hasten to add best guess because I'm not 100%, I really wish Microsoft would have cleared this stuff up. This is another point that I'd like to make. This is something that's biting them in the butt a little bit. I'm assuming they do, because it doesn't make sense for them not to, because they have tiled resources. So it's like, why would you choose crappier tiled resources than, well, what you could have, especially when it seems that you're basically fairly reliant on it. So I imagine they do. Another point that's a bit confusing regarding the Xbox One's architecture is regarding the ESRAM. Now, there is some confusion at the moment exactly how the ESRAM is being utilized. Now, Microsoft have been fairly honest. They've stated that 204 gigabytes per second presented at hot chips was basically due to the limitations of the logic around the ESRAM. You can't sustain a write for absolutely every single cycle. The write is known to insert a bubble, in other words, a dead cycle occasionally, and 1 out of every 8 cycles is a bubble, so that's how you get the combined of 204. And so, obviously, if you multiply 109 by 2, then it doesn't quite make sense, and so that's basically how they got that. So it was kind of how I initially expected. I expected them to basically have put in a little bit of redundancy there for inefficiency of design, and you know what? I respect that. I respect the honesty in Microsoft part, I do. They could have fudged it, but they didn't, so I respect that. But I still have a few issues regarding the ESRAM. Now, I would like for them to put an example, fairly easy to explain, for those of us who don't know games programming, and even for those of us who do, it'd be good just to have like a basic flowchart of how you would in reality expect developers to use this. Because here's the thing that I think people are becoming really concerned with on message boards, and I'm not trying to say that I'm agreeing with all of the stuff they're saying, but I can understand their point. Here's the basic analysis of it. If I'm a developer, let's ignore the PS4's limitation in RAM. So in other words, just how much is available to developers. Some people argue it's 5.5, some people argue 6, some people argue it'll be up to 6.5. Doesn't matter. Let's just say it's 6 to give it an arbitrary number, and let's assume it's the same for the Xbox One. Let's assume, however, that that's not taking into account the 32 megabytes of RAM. So obviously, let's assume that you have 32 megabytes plus 6 gigs for the Xbox One or 6 gigs for the PS4. Okay, fairly easy to understand. The thing is, this is how people are anticipating this. If I'm a games developer, if you're a games developer, if Bob's a games developer, it doesn't really take a genius to utilize the GDDR5 memory. Now, I'm not saying that you can be wasteful. I'm not saying that you can just be stupid. I'm not saying that it doesn't come with these, a specific range of performance attributes. And this is one thing that I will say that I've noticed from some Sony fans, that they seem to cite 176 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth as this magical fantasy land, and that's not the case. Guerrilla, who of course are producing Killzone, Shadowfall, and you can check this out. I've got the slides on RedGamingTech.com, but they did do a breakdown of their own analysis, and they said that, look, they have loads of memory bandwidth, but that's only if you're smart. In other words, you cannot just be frivolous. I do love that word. And you cannot just waste it with silly, bits of code. You have to use your loops very smartly, especially spin locks as well, which really affect the CPU side of things as well. And I believe they're also talking about pixel formats. In fact, they were. Let me just read it out to you. This is verbatim from Guerrilla. PS4 is really easy to program for. Wide multi-threading is a must. Consider using jobs. Be nice to the OS thread scheduler and avoid spin locks. GPU is really fast. Watch your vertex shader outputs. Don't be afraid of using conditionals. A lot of the stuff is programming, for example, spin locks and conditionals and so on, obviously. GDDR5 bandwidth is awesome. And then they add, if you map your memory properly, use the smallest pixel format for the job. Use compute and tell us about your experiences. So they hasten to add that you still have to be careful with what you're doing with the memory bandwidth. So don't think that just because GDDR5 is, a lot of memory bandwidth, you can be wasteful of it. There still is finite amounts of it. And I don't think many people expect it to be this infinite well where you can keep digging down. I did say that I have done a little bit of calculations on this, and it's not particularly hard. You can just basically multiply the amount of GC, or should I say divide the amount of GCN units by 176 gigs, and then you can do the same with like a desktop type of card, and it gives you a very arbitrary number. And you can see that Sony are basically in the ballpark. They have got some overhead in there, and of course a lot of that is going to be eaten up with, say, the CPU and so on. And that makes sense because obviously the CPU does have to access main system memory and so on. It's not exactly the most accurate way of doing things, but it gives you a rough gauge. It's not an exact gauge, but gives you a rough gauge to say, okay, I understand that Sony are probably on the right path. So we've got Sony covered, but here's the thing, Microsoft. We're not exactly sure how you expect the 32 megabytes of RAM to work, because here's the thing. The interview gave a really great example. They were talking about textures. I'm going to read you guys out the exact part. Imagine you've rendered to a depth buffer there in ESRAM, and now you're switching to another depth buffer. You may want to go and pull what is now a texture into DDR so that you can texture it out later, and you're not doing tons of reads from the texture, so it actually makes sense to do it in DDR. So you can use the move engines, blah blah blah, that part doesn't matter. Here's the thing. The point being that now you've got to move that memory. Now, I understand from the perspective of the Xbox One, in terms of hardware, the CPU and the GPU are not being used to move that data, okay? But I would love to know just how much coding work it is. And I don't have a development kit, and I'm not the best at C++. I am learning it, but learning it and being a fully fledged games engine program are two different things. But even so, let's take into effect that even if you're the best programmer in the world, you probably don't have access to the Xbox One's development kit. I'd like to hear from developers just how hard it is to utilize this and how much work it is to do. This is something that is a concern for a lot of people, because people can understand that 8 gigabytes of GDDR5, you don't have to be a genius to know that it doesn't matter where you map something in memory, as long as you're not being wasteful, as long as you're being smart with the resources you've got, the code is going to work fine. People are concerned that you're going to have to start moving data around a bit, and there's some theories that are going around. Some people are stating that it's probably going to be used as a conjunction for, say, a frame buffer and, say, tiled resources, or maybe a scratch pad. So what's going to basically happen is you're going to have something rendered, it's going to be put to DDR, which is how Microsoft seem to be saying this. So in other words, it will be rendered off in the GPU, it will be sent to main system memory, and then when it's actually needed and called that texture, then it will be sent via coherent memory bandwidth, I'm assuming, to the GPU. The problem with all of this is it sounds a lot more work than just, well, that data's there, that's the end of it. I think another problem that people have is the lack of the CUs. Now, there are a couple of issues that I've been reading about, and this is a really big topic, and goes heavily into 3D graphics, so I don't want to go super into it because I'll be here for quite a long time, but it really comes down to people reading what Microsoft is saying and making some educated guesses, and that's what they are, they're educated guesses, because we don't have their full system. We don't know everything about their architecture. In fact, right there in this article, it actually says that some stuff that they're not revealing at the moment regarding compute, which I understand and I accept. I'm sure Sony are holding some stuff back as well that we'll probably hear quite soon. But let's go with what we do know. Now, they were talking about the CUs. Now, they got really blasted on a couple of the message boards that I was reading, because people were stating, well, how is it that you believe that adding an initial 2 CUs, and they, in their development kits they have 14 CUs, which makes sense because that's a lot closer to the actual proper Radeon card configuration. So how the hell is it that you can put in 2 additional CUs and you get less performance than, and this isn't my words, this is theirs, measly 53 megahertz clock speed increase? Now, the leading theory is, and there are a couple, that this has got to do with the layout of the system. For one, it increases the speed of the ESRAM, which, considering the ESRAM's job, I'm fairly sure you'll all agree that it's not going to be bad to have more memory bandwidth, despite the fact that the amount of memory is piddly compared to the main system RAM. For the job that it's doing, especially if it is doing something like, say, frame buffering and helping to actually render the pixels on screen and whatever else it's doing, especially if it is involved in, say, texturing or lighting or whatever, yeah, it's going to really make a difference. Another leading theory, and this theory actually comes to us from GPU Gems, which is actually from NVIDIA, but still, I imagine most of it would be completely and utterly applicable to AMD anyway. And it's basically stating that, well, it's kind of to do with the ROPs. Now, some theories indicate that there are enough ROPs on the Xbox One to render the titles at the resolution that is the target, so in other words 1080p or below. Some theories, however, state that there's not enough bandwidth to feed the ROPs. I'm going to read you guys out a very small quote. The best way to test this, if your application is frame buffer bandwidth bound, is to vary the bit depths of the colors or the depth buffers, or both, if reducing your bit depth buffers from 32 to 16-bit, in other words, reducing the amount of colors involved, significantly improves your performance, then you are definitely frame buffer bandwidth bound. Frame buffer bandwidth is a function of the GPU memory clock, so modifying memory clocks is another technique for helping identify this bottleneck. So if you're on a PC, you would simply overclock your overclock your GPU's memory. And this comes to texture bandwidth, and texture bandwidth is consumed anytime a texture fetch request goes out to memory. Although modern GPUs have texture caches designed to minimize extraneous memory requests, they obviously still occur and consume a fair amount of memory bandwidth. Modifying texture formats can be trickier than modifying frame buffer formats when inspecting the ROP. Instead, we recommend changing the effective texture sizes by using large amounts of positive map level of detail LOD bias. This makes texture fetches access very coarse levels of map pyramid, which effectively reduces the texture size. Blah 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 blah. It goes on for quite a while. The basic theory behind this is that they are saying that if they added the extra CUs, the other two compute units, they would be ROP bound, or if not actually physically ROP bound, so in other words, the ROPs would be there to process it and would be capable of processing it, but they wouldn't actually have the bandwidth to process and deal with the extra requirements. And that's also a leading theory as well. I do kind of wish that the interviewer or Microsoft had elaborated on that, because then they start going into balance. And as I stated in a previous video, people have been going ballistic on them when they've said balance, because the problem is when you're saying balance, what the hell does balance mean, right? Because you can make any system, it doesn't matter how crap it is, and a crap system can be balanced. So it's like saying balance doesn't mean a damn thing. What we want to know is, how did you come across these numbers? But this is another problem with dealing with people who are interested in technology, because I'm fairly certain that if Microsoft laid out every single piece of information, people would still complain about something. So, what are my thoughts and conclusions on this interview? I mean, some people are going as far as to say that it's PR, some people are saying it's FUD, some people are, I'm not even going to go into all of it. You can Google yourselves if you want the opinions. I don't want to be seen, mentioning them or taking sides or whatever. But I think that obviously Microsoft wanted to give information, and I think they have. I think that I'm a bit easier in some aspects of the system, but I'm still also really puzzled about several aspects of the system. And some of my concerns, like how difficult the system is to program for, haven't really been removed or that settled. Microsoft is saying, well, developers are used to using EDRAM. The argument automatically becomes, well, the problem is, yeah, people are used to using EDRAM, but that's on an Xbox 360, a system that is considerably slower. When you're dealing with a system 5, 6, 7, 8 times faster, then sure, we understand that, you've got 10 megabytes of EDRAM on the Xbox 360, which wasn't enough, by the way, to act as the full frame buffer at 720p with everything else turned on. But the thing is, the actual GPU didn't require as much memory bandwidth, and people are automatically starting to look at, for example, the DDR3 memory bandwidth and starting to see how it's starting to affect things. You guys could check out GDDR5 versus DDR3 on this channel. It's quite a long video, and it goes into the aspects of the GPU, such as memory bandwidth and latency, which is another point as well. There are a couple of things I've got against this. For example, Microsoft is saying, well, okay, DDR3 is a lot cheaper, so you can put more in. Everyone's counter argument is, okay, you could put more in for exactly the same price, you could double it easily, so why didn't you? Why is it instead, we're left with a system that's $100 more expensive? Microsoft automatically says, okay, well, that's because of Connect and stuff. hardcore gamers automatically reply, well, that's nice, but we don't want Kinect, we want a gaming system. And this is the kind of back and forth that's very, very hard for Microsoft to, well, resolve. I don't necessarily think that 8 gigs of RAM or more at this point would have made much of a difference. I think that 8 gigs probably for the foreseeable future, but that's the problem, foreseeable future. But I don't honestly think if Microsoft had put in double the amount of DDR3 memory, if they'd have put in, say, 16 and let's say 12 gigs was available for games, I don't think they would have had enough compute units or enough performance anywhere else to make the difference. My own personal feelings. For example, you can get graphics cards on the PC which have, well, back in the day, for example, you could get like 2 gigs of RAM, 4 gigs of RAM cards. You can still get them now, of course. But it didn't make a damn difference because, well, the GPU itself just wasn't up to the task. So in other words, it was no longer memory bandwidth or memory starved. It's just simply a case of it could not process the data quick enough anyway. It would probably help in some ways for multitasking. Maybe. We do know that the Xbox One can handle several applications at once, 4 I believe. Only one game, of course. But still, I don't really think the extra memory would have made a huge difference there. Most people are saying, well, why didn't they add in more ESRAM? A lot of people come up with that argument. The problem is, Microsoft also put in things like the Move engines. Now IBM, they put in 128 megabytes of cache, or ESRAM, EDRAM, whatever they were calling it, I've forgotten now, into their GPU, or their SoC, and they decided that would be more than adequate. Unfortunately, Microsoft have other things in there, including the Move engines. And so you get this issue of how big, oh, and also, of course, they are also a, console, so it becomes the question of how big is this SoC going to be if then you put in more space for the GPU, for the extra ESRAM and so on. So, yeah. I don't necessarily agree with their decision of ESRAM. I might change my mind. Maybe if, developers speak out enough and they say it's actually not that bad to work with, here's how we're getting around it, or Microsoft's tools are very good. And that's another point as well. We do know that Microsoft are improving their tools and technologies. I guess we'll just have to see. There's still a lot of stuff that is unresolved, but I think we're kind of getting there now. I feel that compared to just, say, 2 months ago, we know a ridiculous amount. There was a lot of theories, a lot of ideas and far-fetched notions that were being flung about, but now we're starting to understand things and say, okay, this is how data is being processed on A, this is how the data is being processed on B. I understand this. I also noticed that Microsoft is starting to push the cloud thing a little bit less now, which is also rather interesting to me. I guess we'll just have to see. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed this video. I am sure we're not even slightly done with the Xbox One and PS4 arguments, but for this interview I think we've analysed everything fairly well. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.